Everyone, my name is Riley. I'm 26 years old. I feel a little guilty about hiding one big secret from my boyfriend. I hid my child from him. In the end, it just broke his heart. But this sacrifice was not in vain, because in the end, I found harmony inside myself. The guy who changed my life was Dan. I was at an IT forum. We were developing an app for a smart home system, and Dan's exhibition stand was right next to ours. And at some point, I had an argument with him. The language of IT specialists is very specific, so I won't go into details. But our argument was really intense. At one point, I even started yelling at him. And to lighten the mood, Dan asked me to have coffee with him. So we talked a little more in a more relaxed atmosphere. And later that night, someone knocked on my hotel room door. I opened the door and I saw Dan there. He was just standing there with a silly smile and a bottle of wine. Of course, I let him in, and half an hour later, we were kissing very passionately. In the morning, we were both late for the start of the forum, and we just spent the rest of the day looking at each other with a smile. Then the forum ended and we went back to our respective cities, and I thought my little affair was over. But despite the fact that we had spent so little time together, I really liked Dan, and I wanted to continue our relationship. So I was over the moon when he texted me on Facebook and asked me to come visit him. Of course, I immediately accepted the tickets and flew to see him. For a few more months, we chatted and met at other forums and exhibitions. Each time we got closer and closer. And in the end, Dan asked me to move in with him. I was happy to say yes. I lived with Dan in his beautiful house, and everything was just wonderful. However, as I said, I had always kept a little secret from him. I didn't want him to know that I gave up my own child. Dan would think I was a terrible person, and he wouldn't be able to really love me anymore. And each month, I had to spend at least a few days in my hometown. I guess it's time to confess to you and reveal this secret. I previously had a husband and a child. But don't get me wrong, I didn't cheat on my husband. Oh, let me try to explain everything. Almost 8 years ago, I got married and we decided to have a child. We were the happiest couple on earth. And then I gave birth to a baby boy. We named him Bruce. And everything was just fine until the moment when doctors diagnosed our child with cerebral palsy. It just broke me into pieces. My child, my love. We'd been fighting for his health for years. And year after year, it took all my strength away. I was getting more and more sad and depressed. It was like I had received a life sentence and I was chained to my child. After a few years, I had changed from being a young, beautiful woman to an old, evil granny who had been beaten up by life. The problems with my child had taken all of the color out of my life, and there were no positive feelings left in it at all. In addition, my relationship with my husband had become very different. It was like I stopped loving him, and we just became partners that were trying to raise a child together. Because in the midst of all these circumstances, I became terribly depressed. A year later, it ended in a nervous breakdown, and my health was at risk. And then my husband made a serious decision. He decided to let me go. As Jacob said, I shouldn't have ruined my life because I was so young. He could take care of the baby on his own, and I could start over and be happy. Oh, he was probably the kindest man on earth. And then I made this compromise. I visited my son and husband several times a week, and the rest of the time, I tried to get my life back on track. So now you see the whole situation, and you can understand why I kept it a secret. For many people, this may have seemed terribly immoral, but please don't judge me. But when I started living with Dan, it became much more difficult to hide this secret. We were together for 6 months, and I always had to come up with excuses for why I needed to fly somewhere. I usually said it was a work trip or I was visiting my parents. Of course, at some point, Dan began to suspect that I was lying. The fact is that both my husband and child sometimes messaged to me on Facebook, and their names were displayed on the screen. Plus, my son sometimes wrote me actual letters to practice his writing, and I had to hide the envelopes from Dan. This could not go unnoticed, and Dan's anxiety and jealousy reached a critical high point. We had a few fights, and he didn't want to let me go on a trip next month. But I couldn't miss my son's birthday party. So we had a very big fight, and I was afraid that our relationship might crumble after that. So one way or another, I went back to my hometown and tried to arrange the best birthday for Bruce. We had his friends, games, a cake with candles, and all that. In the evening, when all the guests had left and Bruce had gone to bed, my ex-husband and I sat on the porch and just talked. Despite everything, we still had a good relationship, and we were good friends. But suddenly, a taxi pulled up to the house, and the man who got out of it was Dan. He must have found the letters from my son and gotten the address. Of course, he thought I was cheating on him, and here I was sitting with my ex-lover on the porch. There was a big fight, and Dan was insulting and yelling at me and my ex-husband. We couldn't even say anything back to him. He was furious. It looks like his screaming woke up Bruce, and he came out to check and see what was going on. At that moment, the argument stopped, and Dan just froze in a daze. I thought that this was the best time to take him aside and talk to him calmly. So I did. I told him everything, from the very beginning. But all he said was that he needed to think about it, and then he left. I thought I would never see him again after that, and I felt very bad because I really loved Dan, and I was sorry to lose him. Suddenly, Dan called me in the morning. He had stayed up all night and thought about the whole situation. Dan wasn't mad at me, and he said we both needed to take responsibility. I had to be there for my son, and he was willing to help me with that. So from that moment on, our lives changed. Dan rented a house in the neighborhood, and we moved in. Now my son spent half the week with us, half the week with my ex-husband. I didn't expect such a decision from Dan, and I was very grateful to him for all that he had done. But life with a child was much more difficult than we thought. Bruce had a hard time forgiving me for leaving him for such a long time. Our relationship was fine, but he categorically refused to accept Dan. Oh, he just hated him from the beginning. Bruce didn't like the house he lived in. He didn't like everything Dan did for him. He wouldn't let us be alone. He refused to talk to Dan. Once Dan even made us a wonderful dinner, but Bruce demonstratively threw his plate on the floor. As he said, he already had a dad, and Dan was a stranger that he hated. It was so sad to watch all of this because Dan was trying so hard to please my son. But that wasn't the most difficult part. The thing is, I had started spending more time with my ex-husband. We took our son to therapy together, and we saw each other every few days. I know I had a boyfriend that I loved, but I looked at Jacob and wondered how strong he was. He raised Bruce almost alone, and he survived the trials that broke me. And I started to feel the old years inside me start moving again. In the end, I broke up with Jacob because I couldn't bear the grief of a disabled child. But now I looked at his strength and bravery, and that glow attracted me. And one day, I decided to make the first move. I brought Bruce to my ex-husband's house for the weekend, and we started talking about our past. Jacob admitted that he really missed me and wanted to have me back. But each time he would trash this idea because he knew that I would be unhappy again. And he didn't have any other relationship after me. It touched me to the core, and I could no longer stand it. So I kissed him, and I think I made him the happiest man on earth with that kiss. And then we started dating. Of course, we did it in secret from Dan because I didn't want to break his heart. However, everything secret always becomes clear, and one day it happened. Dan worked from home, and he had to watch Bruce. I said I was going shopping with my friend, but I was really going to spend the whole day with Jacob. But as usual, Bruce rebelled against my boyfriend. As far as I know, he did something to Dan's laptop. It was the last drop of patience Dan had, so he put Bruce in the car and drove him to Jacob's place. Unfortunately, he caught us at the most awkward moment. When he came into the house, Jacob and I were on the couch, and we weren't watching a movie. We were enjoying each other, and we didn't even notice Dan right away. Oh, just so you understand, the next second there was a huge fight. Dan was chasing Jacob, and I thought he was going to destroy him. Thank God no one was injured. But now the whole truth was revealed, and nothing could be fixed. It was over. Dan couldn't forgive me for this betrayal. That evening, he packed up his things and left for his hometown. But I wasn't left alone. I went back to my son's house and the man I loved. For now, I feel very bad. Dan loved me and he did everything to make me happy. Damn it, he moved to another city for me and tried to adopt a child who hated him. And what I did? Just disgusting. However, it was only after all these events that I was able to understand what I really wanted. I shouldn't have left my husband and child in the first place. No matter how difficult it was then, I had to overcome all the difficulties now. Now I'm going to try to be a better mom and a better wife for Bruce and Jacob. And I will never lie or hide anything again because I know that it can cause